Hello, everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm super impressed that you're all here and not at watching the Warriors game or the even more exciting gubernatorial debate. So that wasn't a laugh line. We're really glad that you're with us tonight for our next installment of the Chronicle Chats. I'm Audrey Cooper, the editor-in-chief of the San Francisco Chronicle. And if any of you have been here before, you know I've said this. We started this event series as a way of promulgating the Chronicle's mission, which is to tell the story of San Francisco, the region whose people are continually changing the world. And I really think that in order to make good on that topic, we have to start by listening to the people who are actually doing it. Tonight, we're joined not only by you in the audience, but everybody who's watching us on sfchronicle.com, on our Facebook live stream. This conversation, if you just can't get enough of it the first time, will also be available on our podcast series, which you can check out on the iTunes Store or wherever you get your podcasts. And I mostly want to see if we have any subscribers in the audience tonight. Anyone? Well, thank you very much. On behalf of our newsroom of 200 journalists, we literally could not do any of our work without the support of our subscribers, and we appreciate you being here. For anyone else who is not a subscriber, we would encourage you to do so. And also, please come to our next Chronicle Chats events. We have 2 more planned so far this year, one on technology and how it's affecting our human relationships, and the other one is going to be on arts, which will be really exciting. I think you definitely want to get to that one. So tonight's conversation is a little different than the politically focused ones that we've had in the past. Tonight we're going to be talking science, and more specifically, eternal youth. Anyone want to live forever? Yes? Okay, a couple of you, good. I told my husband, I was like, well, I want to live forever, but I don't know if I want everybody else to live forever. This is the question of ageless bodies. Is this science or science fiction? Perhaps somewhere in between. And I'm going to be joined by 2 men who might solidly end up on different sides of that equation tonight. We're going to be taking audience questions after a little bit of discussion, so please think about what you want to ask, and we'll be going around with some microphones. We definitely want to hear from you. So our first guest is Dr. Aubrey de Grey, a biomedical gerontologist based in Mountain View. He serves as Chief Science Officer of the SENS Research Foundation, a research charity that funds research focused on defeating the aging process. He is also VP of a new technology discovery startup, Ageless Therapeutics. And he is the editor-in-chief of Rejuvenation Research, a peer-reviewed journal focused on intervention in aging. So you have one EIC named Audrey and the other EIC named Aubrey. I hope you can tell us apart. His work focuses on self-inflicted cellular and molecular damage that constitutes aging and the design of interventions to repair that process. He is a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and the American Aging Association. Please welcome Dr. Aubrey de Grey. There's a couple of things that keep us apart, so you won't be confused. Our other partner in this conversation is Dr. William Hurlburt, a medical doctor and adjunct professor in the Department of Neurobiology at Stanford University Medical Center. Dr. Hurlburt is fascinated with the intersection of ethics and advancing biomedical technology, as well as the intersection of theology and philosophy of biology. In addition to his teaching, he has worked with NASA on projects on astrobiology and as a member of the Chemical and Biological Warfare Working Group at Stanford's Center for International Security. He's also the co-leader of a new initiative entitled The Challenge and Opportunity of Gene Editing, a project for reflection, deliberation, and education. From 2002 to 2009, Dr. Hurlburt served on the President's Council of Bioethics, which, among other things, considered the ethics of everlasting life. Dr. Hurlburt, would you join me out here? So thank you both for being here tonight with us and skipping the Warriors game. We thought that it might be a good start if we gave you both a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and your interest in this topic. So Dr. de Grey, you want to go first?
Sure. So, so I guess I've already been introduced. So let me give you a 2-minute summary of my position on this. So I'm a biologist. I work on the effort to develop new medicines that will bring aging under control. Therefore, the right place for me to start in explaining what I do and why I do it is obviously to explain what aging is. And this is something which should not need to be explained because we've had it for a long time. But the fact is, you ask 10 people what aging is and you'll get 10 different answers. That's not good. So what is aging? It's simply the accumulation of self-inflicted damage in the body. So in that sense, it is just the same in the human body or in the body of any other living animal as it is in an inanimate machine like a car or an aeroplane. It's really a fact of physics, not just biology, that any machine with moving parts is going to generate damage to itself that accumulates over time and that eventually exceeds the tolerance of the machine, the amount of damage that the machine is capable of having without a significant decline in function. That's all that aging is. It's not a mysterious thing, it's not an enigma, it's just the accumulation of self-inflicted damage. Now, the first question we have is, why does this matter? And of course, the answer is, it's bad for you. It makes you sick. I work on this because fundamentally I have always, since the beginning of my life, I have wanted to make a difference to people's quality of life. I have wanted to make a difference to people's, to the human condition. And the fact is, one's health is a massive, in fact, possibly the biggest influence on one's happiness, on the human condition, on one's quality of life. One's quality of life certainly determines, in many people's minds, and I would not dispute this, the value of life. And certainly that underlies why today, when we don't have medicines that can prevent the decline in quality of life that happens in later life, why people feel often that it's not a priority to try to extend that life, because that life has, in many people's view, increasingly little value as it has increasingly little quality. Therefore, the massive thing I want to emphasize here is that I don't work on longevity. I work on health. I am interested in keeping people in a good state of health, not just good for their age, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean, but actually good, however long ago they were born. That's what I do. The longevity consequences of this are a side effect. And we are going to talk extensively this evening, I suspect, about the nature of that side effect and the pros and cons of it. But a critical thing that I want you to hold in your mind at all times this evening and going forward from this evening is that it is an inextricable consequence of something else, namely the maintenance of health, which is something that most people do not have any kind of ambivalence about. Most people feel that health is something that is unequivocally, unconditionally better than ill health, however long ago the person in question was born. And that is all that I do. I think I'll just stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you heard, I'm a physician. I've spent my entire professional life thinking about the advances in biotechnology, which were starting to gain momentum when I was a medical student at Stanford. I studied with some of the major figures in modern biology. Paul Berg won the Nobel Prize for recombinant DNA. Arthur Kornberg won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA polymerase. I sat in the classroom and I realized there was a revolution coming and that we needed to think carefully about the implications of our new powers over all of human life and all of living nature, actually. A few years ago, I met a woman who was 104 years old and got into a nice conversation with her. She was very cogent and quite capable physically. She could walk and was enjoying her life. And she told me that the happiest years of her life were after she turned 80, because after that she stopped worrying about dying young. And then she got a little wistful, and she said, "But my husband died 56 years ago. All of my children have died, and some of my grandchildren have died." What a poignant mystery we're part of, this strange drama of love and death. And what an amazing moment we're at in the history of life. The traditional role of medicine has been to cure disease and alleviate suffering, to restore the patient to a natural level of functioning and normal natural life process. But now with our new biotechnology, we're opening new possibilities, both for extending health and transforming health and the meaning of life in certain very dramatic ways. At the founding of the Society for Regenerative Medicine in around the year 2000, William Hazeltine said, "The real goal is to keep people alive forever." So the traditional role of medicine was to cure disease, but now the new paradigm of medicine is liberation. Liberation not just from disease, but from all that is inconvenient, imperfect, unattractive. We've come to expect from medicine things with lifestyle drugs, cosmetic surgery. We're now expecting more from medicine. In a way, we've always wanted more from medicine, even though there's a certain preoccupation, there's almost a sickness in being preoccupied with health, but we've always actually wanted more in the lives. And now biotechnology is coming into an arena where we may be able to operate on natural human life. This is perhaps just one of a very broad range of interventions that we could see. But this issue of life extension, health extension, and the inevitable life extension that might come are a distillation of a larger question: how are we going to operate with our new powers over nature and human nature? So I'm looking forward very much to this conversation. Thank you.
Well, I think you've answered my first 5 questions, so we'll just get right into it. I take from your comments that what we're really talking about here is not just living forever, but actually extending and becoming almost ageless into time. Is that, and that would be a moral benefit or some sort of benefit, but just merely preventing disease so we can extend our lifespan is not necessarily the aim of your work.
I think that's accurate, yes. The fact is that most people feel subjectively, as well as objectively and about other people, that the value of life is diminished when one is less healthy. And therefore, there is an inherent linkage between the desirability of long life and the desirability of long, healthy life, which is a damn good thing, because there is also an absolutely intrinsic physical, biological linkage between the feasibility of long life and the feasibility of long, healthy life. We will never achieve a situation in which we keep people alive for much longer than today in a poor state of health. Being sick is risky, and it always will be. You will die soon if you stay sick. Therefore, this is all about keeping people healthy. And that's what makes all of the moral and ethical and so on arguments, to my mind, moot. Because nobody that I have ever encountered or ever debated with has stood up and unabashedly, unashamedly stated that health is only good for people who were born recently. Everybody agrees, as far as I can tell, that health is better than ill health, however long ago you were born. And that is all you need to know. Everything else follows, not just argumentatively, but logically from that. It is logically inconsistent to say that long life is, up after some limit, bad, but health is not.
So this is not necessarily a new idea that we want to prolong healthy life. This has been along for millennia. People were looking for the fountain of youth. How has our ideas on aging or an ageless body changed in your research?
Well, for all of human history, we have been framed and constrained by certain limits that the natural world imposed on us. And it's very interesting if you go back in history, for example, to the biblical account of history, you see that the statement is that a normal lifespan is 70, or by reason of strength 80. But it's very interesting, by the way. There's a place in the book of Genesis where God is speaking and actually says the lifespan will be 120. You aware of that? Isn't that interesting?
Of course.
And so what that points out is that people knew all along that something was taking us out younger, because even at the turn of the century, the last century, and year 1900, the average life expectancy in America was less than 50 years, something like 47 years. And now it's approaching 80, and average for women is over 80. So we're now approaching what might be our underlying capacity, natural capacity for long life, if we're freed from the burden of infectious diseases and acute illnesses, and if we govern ourselves intelligently with regard to diet, sanitation, and activities. I mean, we're learning about exercise, and we're finding ways. All of those changes in the 20th century have come forth from kind of intelligible operations on our life schedule and life process. But now, what's different is we're starting to understand, along with a lot of things in basic biology, we're getting a sense of the basic roadmap of the biochemical processes that undergird and overarch our lives. And that raises the prospect of actually intervening in what has broadly been considered natural aging processes that are the frame on which early life was played out against.
So, I always thought of aging as a series of things I did to myself. I ate badly, so I gained weight and my knees hurt, and that's, now you can't fix them anymore because you're not 20. But you actually write that aging is not unlike what just naturally happens to your car when it starts to fall apart. So can you break down for us non-science majors in the room, what is the actual science that you're investing in, and how will that lead to us being able to live longer?
Sure, and I'm going to do it by reference to the kind of form of words that you just used. Because the things that you said are mutually incompatible in a way that you, and indeed most of the audience, probably don't realize. On the one hand, you're talking about things as natural. You want to really get away from that word. Because the fact is, everything that we have achieved already with medicine was already natural beforehand. Infections are no less natural than aging, right? And yet, we got on top of infections. In fact, the whole of technology, not just medicine, the whole of technology is all about deviating from the natural, figuring out how to manipulate and distort the natural in a manner that works for us. But the thing that you said that was incompatible with that, which was kind of true but you don't know it, is that aging is something that you're doing to yourself. Because it sure as hell is. the thing is that the things that you're doing to yourself that are driving aging to the greatest extent are not things that you have a choice about. The single biggest thing that you're doing to yourself that is causing you to age is breathing. And I do
This
not
is a problem.
And I do not mean breathing contaminants, pollutants in the air. I mean the oxygen that you're breathing. Because evolution, despite its insane ingenuity, has succeeded only once, about 2.5 billion years ago, in developing a method to use oxygen as a tool with which to extract energy from nutrients and use that energy in a variety of, in all the manner of ways that we do to keep our bodies going. And that method that it developed isn't very clean. It unfortunately has side effects. It generates byproducts at a low but irreducible rate. These byproducts are called free radicals, and they are very nasty. Or at least they become very nasty after a bunch of other subsequent steps. And the result is we have damage to our DNA, damage to proteins, damage to fats and lipids and so on. You know, it's bad. But breathing is rather non-negotiable, right? Right?
I find it to be, yes.
Quite. So in a way, aging is natural in the sense that you probably meant it. It's the side effect of things that we have to do to stay alive. But on the other hand, it's also potentially amenable to technological, specifically medical, intervention. The reason why we're having this debate here, why people like Bill and myself are invited to speak to large audiences, is because it might, and I say it is, be possible to actually develop the technology to transcend this natural thing fairly soon, like, for example, in time for most of the people in this room.
So, yeah, there's some investors in the audience, I think. So just to clarify, what your work has been about is not fixing the disease that eventually offs you, because if we cured diabetes, cancer, heart disease, we're still only extending our life expectancy by 90 to 90 years or something like that. You're talking about not going after the cause, the thing that actually kills you in the end, but extending it before you get to that point.
That's right, but let me say that in different, that's correct, but let me say it in slightly different words because I think that will be a little bit more illuminating. The key thing that people get wrong in this, and here I'm talking about the general public, but also even most people in the medical world and the research world, is they actually think of the diseases of old age as diseases. Alzheimer's disease, things like that. This is fantastically counterproductive. Basically, the problem with thinking of the chronic, progressive conditions of old age as diseases is twofold. On the one hand, it makes people in their subconscious think about these things as rather like infections. In other words, potentially amenable not just to medical intervention, but to the same inherent type of medical intervention that works against infections, which is ridiculous. It's brain dead, because basically, these chronic progressive aspects of conditions of old age are side effects of being alive. That's why they are specific to old age, right? Similarly, it is counterproductive because it tries to make an artificial and biologically meaningless distinction between some aspects of aging and other aspects. Aspects of aging that we choose to give disease-like names to and aspects of aging that we don't. That distinction is purely semantic. There is no such distinction from a biological perspective. And if we start to understand and remember that, then we have a chance of seeing two things. First of all, that the so-called diseases of old age are actually just as undesirable as the bits of aging that we call aging itself. There's no difference. And we should not be making this distinction that says, oh, Alzheimer's is terrible, but aging itself is some kind of blessing in disguise. That's bullshit, because the two things are indistinguishable. But also, it tells us from a feasibility point of view. We've already decided that it makes sense to try to cure Alzheimer's disease, which must mean that it's possible. Then we ought to think the same thing about aging itself, whatever the hell that's supposed to be. right? So this artificial distinction does huge damage.
Do you think that the efforts out there now to cure all disease, like the Chan Zuckerberg Institute wants to do, for example, is that missing the point of trying to extend good life and have a moral righteousness in this cause? Or should we be focusing on just feeling better longer? Do you know what I'm saying? Should we be going after the disease, or should we be going after the underlying aging process?
Well, I think as Aubrey just said, there's a continuum. It's not an easy thing to parse diseases of old age from aging process. And I am very pleased by the Chan Zuckerberg initiative. I think it's a constructive. I'm a physician, after all. And likewise, I agree with Aubrey that it's not a matter of living our natural lives. Smallpox is natural too. It's a question, though, of what a proper target of our medical intervention is, and what we need to consider, as we said, the byproduct of being alive versus a reasonable target for medical therapy. The challenge here, we have a little bit of a disagreement here now in the...
It's about time.
Yeah,
What?
I was going to
The what?
wonder.
It's about time we had a disagreement.
Yes. So a little bit of a disagreement with regard to the way we see aging versus disease. Now, I certainly agree that aging sets the conditions for a lot of disorders, and eventually your body wears out, and you die of some specific organ failure or system failure, and that is the normal course of life. And the question is, could we intervene in some of these basic biochemical processes and a variety of things, circuits and stem cells and regenerations and so forth, in such a way that we might kind of erase or ameliorate some of these underlying body-wide problems? And should we call them disease? Should we equate them with disease, or should we accept them as the larger frame of a normal life cycle? And that is not an easy question at all. I agree. And doesn't have a simple moral imperative to it. But just to explore that, let me ask Aubrey, how, if we did that and did the kinds of things you think we can do, how long would a natural human life, a well cared for human life, extend?
There would no longer be an answer to that question, because the question incorporates, by its implicit definition of the word natural, the existence of aging. The only reason we can use the word natural in sentences like that is because aging happens and kills people, makes people sick and eventually dead, at more or less the same age. The range of ages at which people get sick and dead is really small. The standard deviation relative to the mean is really small. Whereas with infections, that's not true. That's why the curve of survival 300 years ago was more or less a radioactive decay, and the curve has been, as they say, rectangularized now. If it hadn't been for that, if it were not for that particular feature of aging, that it happens at more or less the same rate in everybody, we would not have this addiction to the word natural.
Okay.
But you want a number.
But
yeah.
So there wouldn't be
a number.
Okay.
How many years?
So there would not. It absolutely would not be a number. We would have a situation in which the average time that people would live, and I'm talking average here, remember, not maximum, average time that people would live would be determined by risks of death that do not have to do with one's health.
It's like getting hit by the munibus.
Or the planet being hit by an asteroid, all of those things.
Okay. You're probably more likely to get hit by
we also know that those probabilities are likely to decline as time goes forward, with self-driving cars and so on, right? So again, we have no way to predict this. And what I'm saying is, that's the wrong issue. That's the wrong question to be even thinking about. What matters is the near term, people's health. And if people alive 100 years, 1,000 years from now, happen to be the same people who are alive today, that's not the thing that should be on our minds right now. What should be on our minds right now is quality of life.
Does it strike you as odd when people say, but I don't want to live
Not
forever?
at all. And the reason it doesn't strike me as curious is because people who say that are thinking in terms of what they currently understand to be the relationship between how long ago you were born and how healthy you are, therefore your quality of life. People do find it, and that's perfectly normal, perfectly reasonable. People do find it really hard to imagine a world in which your passport needs to have an extra digit on its age thing because you're more than 100 years old or more than this, right? But yet you still are able to keep up with your granddaughter or your great-granddaughter on the dance floor. This is not a world that people find easy to imagine.
I don't know if I agree with that, because if you put yourself in the world of like the Twilight books or any of that stuff where everybody lives forever, I think there are a lot of people who say after a while, wouldn't that just I don't know.
But there's an easy explanation for that. There's an easy explanation for that, which is that 99% of the vast quantity of science fiction that is focused on a post-aging world of one kind or another is dystopic. They have built into the story, without any kind of criticism, right, an assumption that isn't true. Like, there'll be too many people, so it's got to be limited to a small number of people, or whatever. Or they've got to be vampires. Anything, whatever it is. The fact is, they build in an assumption for dramatic element, and people go away happy because they believe it, because they want to believe it, because they don't want to get their hopes up.
Oh, okay.
Well, so let me ask you a question. The last time we debated, that was down in Silicon Valley, remember at Xerox Park, and you spoke of longevity escape velocity.
Right.
And you said point blank, I remember exactly where we were standing, you said, if I can just live 35 more years, I'm confident that I will live to be 1,000.
Yeah, so this is really a bit of a technicality. It just describes why it's realistic for people today to expect to not hit aging at all, not have any kind of decline in health as they get older. If we look at the kinds of technologies that people like SENS Research Foundation, the organization built around my work, or other organizations now are developing, then it is totally not realistic to suggest that those technologies on their own would give us more than 50 years of life. I normally think it's about 30, okay, over and above what we already have. And I think that it's also not realistic to believe that those technologies will come along in the next 5 years in a sufficiently comprehensive manner to work. But I think 20 years from now is probably a 50-50 chance. Okay. However, only an extra 30 years. Therefore, for anybody alive today to live to 200, shall we say, let alone 1,000, we would need some kind of amplification step. And so when I talk about longevity escape velocity, all I'm doing is saying, actually, yes, the amplification step is going to happen. It's absolutely certain to happen. Well, very, very, very nearly certain to happen, simply because what's going to be required as step 2 and 3 and 4 will be simply incremental refinements of step 1 that gets us to 30 additional years. And we have seen, without exception, in other technologies throughout history, that this is exactly what happens. You make the fundamental breakthrough, you never know how long it's going to take. Lord Kelvin was very over-pessimistic about powered flight, but Leonardo da Vinci was very over-optimistic. You can argue that both ways. But once the fundamental breakthrough has been made, that can be built upon incrementally by small steps, game over. The progress is reliable and relatively rapid.
Well, you have a lot more confidence in these breakthroughs than I do.
Oh, no, not in the breakthroughs, only in the incremental steps afterwards.
You what?
Not in the breakthroughs, only in the incremental steps afterwards.
Well, okay.
Very important. I always say, I think it's a 50-50 chance that we'll get there in 20 years to the first breakthrough, but I think there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get to the first breakthrough for 100 years.
What was that, Stephen?
The first breakthrough, 20 years, the next one, 100.
No, that's not what I said.
No?
Let me do it again. I think there's
We're trying to do some financial planning in our head right now, I think.
I think there's a 50-50 chance, thereabouts, that we will get to what I call longevity escape velocity, the kind of decisive level of comprehensiveness, within 20 years. But I know, and I always say, that the time frame for that first breakthrough is very, very unpredictable. The variance is high. So there's at least a 10% chance that we won't get to that first breakthrough for 100 years. The only thing I'm saying is highly predictable is what happens after the first breakthrough. That once we get there, the incremental advances that need to happen thereafter to keep us above longevity escape velocity are virtually certain to occur.
So you're not sticking with that 35 years anymore. That was 15 years ago.
Yeah, I'm saying exactly that. I'm saying that
15 years ago, but the progress has been interesting, comprehensive, extensive, but I think with every step we go in biology, we realize how much more complicated it really is. I mean, take, for example, genetics. When I was trained, I mean, you could see that it wasn't true, but there was a very simplistic notion that there were genes and there were proteins. You know, there's this simple biology 101 scheme. Now we know that genetics has vast numbers of feedback loops, very, very complicated mechanisms, what's called epigenetics, which means environmental factors that turn genes on and off are increasingly recognized, that the genes don't just operate like an automatic program, that their genes are not nearly as deterministic as we think they are, therefore they're not as easily manipulated as we thought. And when you look out at this web of complex biochemistry, Aubrey has a slide that I've seen other places too. It's this amazing sort of spaghetti network of interactive dynamics. I mean, just think about what we're talking about. Our bodies have maybe 50 to 100 trillion cells. Each of these cells has an estimated 10 million proteins in them that undergo, and other molecules, that undergo chemical reactions estimated at 3 billion a second. These are extremely complicated systems. That's just one cell. The cells are linked by signaling networks, controlled by hormones, an interactive dynamic of circadian rhythms, not just being awake and going to sleep, but all of your body processes are dynamic. And systems, networks, the linear model of causation doesn't apply here. These are networks where there's multitudes of causes, and one cause doesn't just reach out like a tree to many others, but many others reach into it. So that intervening in these systems is extremely difficult.
Which is
I disagree with your model of the car and spare parts.
Right,
I
this is
just
exactly what basic scientists always say.
Complexity of biology.
This is exactly what basic scientists always say, because basic scientists always focus on finding things out, and they are seduced by the complexity of the system they're studying and by the amazing amount that they don't know. The only questions, the best questions for a basic scientist are questions whose answers will create more questions. But technologists are not like that. Technologists are into looking at how we can manipulate nature using what we already know. And the reason why I use this slide that Bill just referred to that emphasizes the complexity of our metabolism is precisely to emphasize that what we need to be looking for if we want to actually manipulate a complex system that we don't understand very well in order to make it behave in the manner that we would prefer, in other words, in this case, not to get sick, is to sidestep our ignorance. Now, of course, when I say that to basic scientists, they say, sidestepping ignorance, obviously impossible. But what I like to point out is that this is exactly what medicine has always done. I like to use the immune system as an example of all of this. So the immune system is one of the more complex components of the human body, and there is no immunologist in the world who would say that we understand the immune system. There is an enormous amount still to be discovered about how this extremely complicated network works. There is also no immunologist in the world who would say that we know only a little bit more about the immune system today than we knew 200 years ago, 150 years ago. Everybody would agree that we know vastly more than we did then. But there is also no immunologist, and indeed no other person in the world who would deny that the immunologists of 150 years ago succeeded mysteriously in saving a very large number of lives with the paltry knowledge that they had. If we had not had Jenner and Pasteur at the time that we did, then an awful lot of people would have died an awful lot younger than they did, and they would have got sick an awful lot younger than they did, and they would not have been cured. This is a rather spectacular example of sidestepping of ignorance, and it is the way that all technology works, and it's about bloody time that basic scientists understood that technologists are better than them at putting together the use of knowledge that we already have. It's not that we disrespect basic scientists. More knowledge is always better. But the assumption that the amount of knowledge that you currently have is pathetically inadequate to actually do anything is palpably false.
Is what?
Palpably flawed.
Well, I don't doubt that there will be some ways we can do some of the low-hanging fruit of this, and that we might find ways to improve health through the lifespan, the so-called extend the health span. I'm actually not convinced that we're going to be able technologically now or in the foreseeable decades, maybe ever, to dramatically extend lifespan. Because I think there might be principled limits, and I think we as a human species may have already hit on a great many of these mechanisms. Now,
like what?
Well, like a lot of the studies on which this techno-optimism is based are fundamentally on simpler organisms for whom it's very clear nature has set the lifespan intentionally at a certain level to account for reproductive possibilities and predation and so forth. So, for example, it's possible now with intervening technologies to extend the life of a mouse 50, 60% over its standard lifespan. But so why didn't nature do that? Why do all these poor little mice have to die between 2 and 3 years old? And the reason probably is because the chances of getting picked off by an owl or a snake are pretty high, and you need to keep the species rolling. Now, roundworms, you can keep them alive 2 or 3 times their normal lifespan. And there are certain things like caloric restriction and so forth that have been studied across the span of creatures. And as you get up to higher and more complex creatures, longer-lived creatures with greater encephalization, means larger brains, and different basic metabolic situations and different life strategies, you find that things like caloric restriction work less and less well. And the human species is a very, very unique one because we're right off the curve. We live longer, not longer than any mammal. It may be that whales and maybe something else lives a little longer, but we live 50%, roughly 50% longer than any other primate. And it's quite interesting to ask why. Now, even in other primates like rhesus macaque monkeys, they've noticed that at times of stress, the troop relies on the older members of the community to find resources of water and even, interestingly enough, medicinal plants for certain disorders that are raging through their group. So there is something in what you might call the culture of monkeys that makes it worthwhile having some older members. But when you apply that principle to human beings, it's very obvious that we're the creature that cooperates with culture. We have continuity of culture, and our understanding of the world is through education is a profound species advantage. And that suggests it's possible that many of the mechanisms on which optimism for longevity studies are based on simpler creatures whose biology is constrained by nature and that we might be unconstrained on some of those levels. And I think you probably agree with me about that possibility, right?
You think? So let me explain the actual truth of this situation. So the fact that calorie restriction works less well in...
Well, maybe we should explain calorie restriction while we're talking about
so in the 1930s, it was discovered that if you feed mice or rats, which typically live a couple of years, less than they would like, then they live longer than they otherwise would. In fact, quite a bit longer. The numbers are basically you reduce calorie intake by maybe 30 or 40%, they live typically 30 or 40% longer. It's been up to 50, as you said, maybe even slightly above 50. If you do this with much shorter-lived species, such as roundworms, then you can get a lot more. And in fact, the current record with the most sophisticated manipulation is a factor of 10 now. Sure enough, conversely, if you go to longer-lived species, such as rhesus macaques, then you get much less. In fact, arguably, hardly anything, a couple of %. So it's not looking terribly good. But the reason for this is not complexity of the species. The reason for this is lifespan of the species. All you need to take into account in order to have a completely trivial explanation of this is the fact that in the real world, in nature, long famines are less frequent than short famines. That's all you need, because the frequency of an environmental circumstance determines the level of selective pressure on the species, generation by generation, to develop or maintain a response to that environmental circumstance. Therefore, irrespective of the species' lifespan, the selective pressure to maintain a particular level of response to that is determined by the length of the thing it's responding to, which, as I say, is not dependent on the lifespan of the species that's experiencing the environmental circumstance. It's the circumstance, right? So it's bleeding obvious that long-lived species, irrespective of their complexity, are going to experience less selective pressure to have a bunch of metabolic acrobatics to optimize their priorities in response to nutrient availability than short-lived species do. And here we are. Now, this generalization, despite being completely obvious, has been rather aggressively and shamefully swept under the carpet by a large number of biologists who get their grants funded by each other to study this. But the fact is it's true. And this leads us to a different and perhaps more fundamental problem with what Bill just said, which is the idea that somehow nature, well, he didn't exactly say this, but it was kind of implied, that nature is somehow we are in opposition to nature. We are trying to transcend and overwhelm what nature's plan is on this. That's the wrong way to think about this. And here's why it's wrong. And this is something I'm saying which is in no way heretical. This is something that 99% of gerontologists would agree with me on. We do not have a program for aging. We do not have genes that cause us to get sick at a particular time after we were born. We simply have a panoply of anti-aging machinery in our body, and that panoply is more comprehensive in long-lived species than in short-lived species, which means that we are on the same side as nature here. Our goal in our attempt to keep people healthy for at an older age is simply to fill in the gaps, the things that evolution has not done for us already, things that evolution couldn't be bothered to do because the selective pressure wasn't sufficient to overcome mutation selection balance. This is really obvious elementary evolutionary biology, and it's really good news, because what it means is that the gaps that we have to fill in are small gaps. I don't believe we will ever achieve longevity escape velocity for mice because their gaps are too big. It's harder for them than for short-lived species to actually defeat aging than it is for long-lived species. Now, this may not be what you thought. You may have thought that things are harder for long-lived species, but find a hole in what I just said.
I'll give you the last word on this topic before we move on. Do you have anything to say about his characterization of your argument?
It's okay, let's go on.
All right, let's go on. Okay, so, I think apart from whether the science is possible enough, one thing, particularly in Silicon Valley and the Bay Area, that we are criticized for not considering is even if you can, should you? And so I'm curious, what would happen to a person's psyche if all of a sudden you could live forever?
Yeah, well, that's what we're actually supposed to talk about here, isn't it? But let me point out that the question between can and should is how. And so I want to come back to you for a little more here. So now, I agree that there are certain things we can do, and some of which are just purely natural, that we can extend our lifespan. You guys want to live a long time, I highly advise you to exercise, for example, and watch your diet.
It's a good doctor response.
To a certain level, we're being poisoned by our prosperity. The kind of lifestyle that our technology has delivered to us already is actually eroding our health. You know, the lifespan actually went down last accounting, just slightly, and it suggests that it's not as simple as that. Now, I mean, it's a sad thing, and I don't say this critically. I understand, sympathetic to human challenges and dilemmas, but we have 5 million people in America 100 pounds or more overweight. That's not good for that person's health. It's not the only value in life, of course, and Thomas Aquinas was so corpulent that the king actually cut a round part on the table so you get closer to the food. And G.K. Chesterton once met George Bernard Shaw at a party, and he said to George Bernard Shaw, who was quite a skinny guy, he said, "Shaw, to look at you, you'd think there was a famine in England." And Shaw said back to Chesterton, who was quite corpulent, "To look at you, Chesterton, you'd think you were the cause of it." But, so yes, I do believe there are things we can do to extend our lives. And I for one, would very much like to have a long life. I'd like to live, I'm aiming for over 100, and I think I have a good chance of making it. I am doubtful about the technological interventions, as I said, partly because of their complexity and partly because of their invasiveness. H.L. Mencken is famous for his statement that for every complex problem, there's usually a simple solution that's wrong.
Einstein said
that
we should keep things as simple as possible, but no simpler.
What was that?
He said Einstein said we should keep things as simple as possible,
Sure.
but no simpler.
No, that's what's simple. That's a notion of that's Occam's razor. We want to go to as scientifically as simple as we can, but life looked at in reality is very complicated. You say that we're learning a lot, and as we learn, I would say that we're learning how complicated it is. At every step, it gets more complicated, more interactive. So we might have a disagreement here. I think it's great for a researcher to have that perspective. I think it's probably good for a physician to have the opposite perspective. One of caution. Our fundamental premise in Hippocratic medicine is, above all, do no harm.
And that is a problem that I believe we need to fix.
Yeah.
I think that the Hippocratic Oath has had its day. In fact, I wrote an editorial some years ago.
That, by the way, is not in the Hippocratic Oath.
Well, no, I know. Yeah, I know.
But here's the thing. So the first century physician Galen said, "The physician is only nature's assistant." Now, that's a very interesting statement. Was he saying that, nature is good? No, that would be foolish. He was probably expressing a kind of respect, maybe even a level of reverence for the complexity and the danger of interventions. Well, that was 2,000 years ago. We have a little better ways of intervening. You'd be surprised how fundamental our medicine is now. But are we going to advance a lot? Yes. Currently, our armamentarium of pharmaceuticals targets roughly 250 protein sites. We're discovering protein sites probably by the thousands every year or two. So yes, we're going to have dramatic capacities to intervene in human life. And by the way, at all levels. I mean, think of your ambitions, your appetites, what you want your life to be. It's going to be a lot more than living long. It's going to be targeted to all sorts of transformative powers in your life. But the question about the simplicity and the complexity comes down to this. At what level are you willing to intervene? Now, if you go on to Aubrey's website, you'll see that he has a certain set of hopeful categories of intervention. And they are all interesting, for sure. And so, they probably all hold some level of possibility, maybe a lot. But at the same time, in the past anyway, he's spoken of quite dramatic things like nanoparticles injected.
I've never done that.
You haven't?
No.
Cybrids?
I've never talked about any of that, no.
Come on now, you're backing off.
I think you're talking about Ray Kurzweil.
I think you're getting more conservative in your old age.
I'm sorry.
It is a byproduct.
I'm sorry,
here's the question, and to address your question. At what level do we want to subject ourselves to preoccupation, micromanagement, continuous invasive procedures, dramatic procedures? I mean, we might very well at some point be capable of generating, I think we will, be capable of generating organs in factories. We might at some point do an entire visceral retread of your body parts, kidneys, maybe intestines, heart, lungs. You just go in and you get new ones.
I think we can answer that question very simply.
That what?
I think we can answer that question very simply and directly by looking at what people do today.
Yeah, that's true.
Today, the vast majority, 80 or 90% of medical expenditure across the entire industrialized world addresses the ill health of old age one way or another. And the industry that calls itself the anti-aging industry is enormous. Now, these are expenditures that society readily and apparently eagerly engages in, despite the fact that they fundamentally don't work. So, another way of phrasing your question is, what would people be interested in doing? How much invasiveness would they be prepared to engage in if it did work? I think the answer is pretty clear, that it would be large. Now, of course, the invasiveness is a problem, it's a downside, and I certainly believe that if these medicines come along initially requiring parts of those medicines involving surgery and so on, then there will be enormous efforts made, enormous pressure to improve the therapies so that they become less invasive and can all be done by injections or oral administration and so on. But that's not to say that the medicines will be undesirable, even at the primitive initial level where they are invasive.
Let's go to the point where you said people will go to great lengths to do it, because I do want to talk about what would happen if and when we get to this point. All of these invasive procedures are expensive. We still don't recognize healthcare as a basic human right in this country, as, you know, for unanimity purposes. So are we looking at a future where only the rich can afford to live forever?
I think that question is a lot easier than it initially seems. And this is a position which I often have to work hard to communicate to the US audience, because as you say, you know, healthcare is a bit of a crazy business over here. And you guys really don't like taxes. But the fact is that you don't have to take the humanitarian imperative into account in order to demonstrate that this will be available universally. The reason you don't need to take it into account is because aging is so expensive. In other words, the unavailability of these therapies, the consequences of the unavailability, because we don't have them yet, is so expensive. In other words, putting it another way, once these therapies do become developed, it will be economically suicidal, completely mercenary economic argument, nothing to do with humanitarian aspect, economically suicidal for any country not to make these therapies available, irrespective of ability to pay, to everybody who's old enough to need them, simply because otherwise they will go bankrupt quickly. The right precedent to look at is not today's expensive medicines. Because today's expensive medicines for the elderly, as I just mentioned, don't work. So the economic arithmetic isn't there. But medicines for the elderly that do work would pay for themselves many times over very quickly. So the best precedent that we have today is not that, but rather basic education. Yes, it's too basic, but the fact is it's universal and for free, even in this crazy tax-averse country, right? So this is the right way to look at it. This will pay for itself so quickly that it will be economically impossible, even if it's electorally possible.
Yeah, but yes, I see the economic argument, but as you know very well, we spend a huge amount of our medical expenditure, which is 19% of our gross domestic product, which is over $3 trillion. We spend a great deal of it on the last 6 months of life. Of course, we don't always. Wait a minute. Let me finish this. We don't always know when the last 6 months is. Okay, but we're still going to have people dying.
But not expensively.
They're going to die, and they're going to have medical expenses at the end of their lives.
Why?
So
hang on, why?
Oh, wait, let me finish. So here's the thing. I agree with some of that. I also agree that people will want to do it. There's a great desperate clinging to life. I feel it too. I want to live. And although I think I will say something more about that later. But right now, the estimates are for how much is spent, not just on our health care, but over-the-counter supplements, schemes. $88 billion a year in America is spent on things related to anti-aging. And many people say they don't want it, but then when you really talk to them, they do. Mm-hmm. I was talking to a guy the other day, a truck driver, who said he didn't want it, but he wouldn't mind keeping his wife young and beautiful forever. So now here's the thing. I disagree. I think I've made that plain. I disagree this is going to be as easy or necessarily even possible as is laid out here. I think Aubrey's a techno-optimist, and I'm not exactly, although I kind of wonder in 500 years, where would we be? I'm sorry, I just don't honestly believe you're going to live to be 1,000. But
MD, PhD.
But let me say this. Let's assume for a moment that this is going to work and that there is going to be longevity, escape velocity. Now we face, let's talk about that. That's what we're actually here to talk about. Should we live forever? So let's ask ourselves, what does that question involve? What is the meaning of it? Because really what it comes down to now is not, if we accept the premise that it's possible, then the next question is it good? And Aubrey has, I think, well answered a lot of the common challenges. We'll be overpopulated, we'll be bored, it'll be unequal and for the rich and the poor. By the way, my feeling about, at least in the foreseeable decades, it will be the poor who are the lucky ones because they won't get experimented on. But bear in mind that even the rich and the elite can be degraded by these kinds of interventions. So the question comes out, what's good? And behind that question is a whole set of questions about what is life for? Where did it come from? Does it have a purpose? Now, you can say back, well, that's everybody's private right to decide that. And at some level, it is. After all, we're in San Francisco and we're all California. We're all a little bit libertarian. So I don't object if Aubrey wants to try to live to 1,000, as long as he agrees not to draw Social Security that long. But the question is, for most of us, those who live normal lives, like the woman I started talking about who lost her husband 56 years before, and had lost all of her children, what constitutes a good increase in longevity? What constitutes a meaningful life, a good life? And a couple of points that, responding to things that Aubrey's already said, is it going to really get to the point where we're going to all die only of extrinsic factors, diseases, that that come on us unexpectedly. There'll be some more. There'll still be infections that we can't stop, but we'll probably cure most of those eventually. But accidents, well, yes, accidents. Isn't that a weird thought that everybody would die perhaps suddenly and abruptly from accidents? There'd be no notion of old age. That's one thing. Second of all, what would it do to our lives if they were drawn out? What would it do to the pace of our lives and the relationships that make our lives meaningful? Would we be connected? When I was serving on the President's Council on Bioethics, we did a whole chapter. I think it's pretty good, don't you think?
Yes, it was very good.
It's in a book called Beyond Therapy, Biotechnology, and the Pursuit of Happiness.
I won't say what I think about it. Go on.
What was that?
I don't think he was a fan, but
Okay.
there
I didn't
are a lot
expect
of
you to.
thought-provoking parts of it.
But I think if you read it, I think you'll see some of the counter-arguments here, but I'll just say a couple more things on that. First, we were talking about this, and I did a calculation. So if a person lived to be 150 years old, and you took the generations at 25 years, then every newborn baby, and suppose everybody lived that long, then every newborn baby would have 64 great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-great-great-grandparents. You get the point, all the way down.
Think about that on Mother's Day this week.
And yet that individual would not be that connected genetically to newborn baby and that person's family, nor would they be connected culturally. I mean, I can barely keep up with my Stanford undergraduates culturally, and at least with my computer. And there be so many people connected by your family lineage that would change the sense and dynamics of a family. Now, that's not necessarily wrong, but it does give you pause. The larger question is this. We're a species that we're a general purpose organism. We've been adapted for adaptability. We're a very diverse organism, but we've had millions of years of antecedent field testing, if you will. Our nature is one where we're packed for all kinds of weather. We're made in a certain way for a certain environment. We're shaped by the environment of our evolutionary adaptation. And the real question is, does the meaning, and what you might call the purpose of our lives, relate to roughly the time frame and the personal dynamics, physical, psychological, social, and one might add spiritual, that we've been made for naturally, sorry to use the word, but that is the truth. The background of our perhaps 5,000 generations of human existence has been framed and constrained by nature. And is it possible that the meaning of our lives is closely embedded in that? And were we to extend our lives, it might have no more benefit than it would if in this hall they played a symphony twice as long as it normally goes. Would it be the same symphony? Would it have the same meaning?
So without going through any of the
Before I just want to say, if anybody has a question, we'll start taking them after these words. So if you find somebody with the microphone or come down to here, you get a turn at it. So sorry to interrupt.
So rather than going through any of the details of what I believe is confused in what Bill said, I want to just condense it into one issue. I believe that Bill, I mean, this may not have been apparent so far, so I want to emphasize it. I have a higher opinion of Bill than I do of most bioethicists who believe that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise. Because he does, make things more explicit. But there's one thing that Bill just said that I think I want to highlight. He says, it's unclear this or that or the other, but it gives you pause. Now, what does that actually mean? What pause? The thing I want to ask Bill is whether he would stand behind the following statement. Does he believe that these issues, these imponderables about the distant future when demography is different and age structure of the population is different, and so on, does he believe that these things should give us pause with regard to hastening and maximizing the availability of health to the elderly? Does he believe that these things should make us hesitate to provide the best possible health care to the elderly that we can, including, of course, hastening the development of medicines that don't yet exist? Because if you don't think that, if you think that health is unconditionally better than ill health, then you should damn well be saying that that's true. Because if it's true, then the pause should be a pause in terms of ignoring these questions, which I have never advocated. I have always said that we should consider how to make the transition to a post-aging world as smooth as possible and as beneficial to as many people as possible. But what I have opposed is the idea that we should in any way slow down the progression to that world.
But isn't that only valuing health above other things like
yes, it is.
Love?
Yes, it is. It's exactly that. It's valuing health above
love, relationships.
Well, I would say, in fact, above absolutely everything else. I would ask Bill, I may not necessarily want to stand behind that statement that health really is.
It's too late.
But I certainly will stand by it for tonight. I want to ask whether Bill would not stand by it, whether there's something that Bill would put ahead of universal health being unconditionally a good thing.
From my perspective, just like preoccupation with appearance, preoccupation with health can be unhealthy.
I didn't mean my own health. I meant health of the population in general.
If you equate technological interventions with health, you're sort of slipping in an assumption that I disagree with fundamentally, and that's the problem here. I am uncomfortable with that. It's a technological perspective, but it's not exactly a medical perspective. It's very hard to answer this, and that's where the dilemma comes up and why we'll all need to do this collectively as a species. But if you just say health, then you're equating longer and longer life. But what if you say that health is the intrinsic powers of the well-working whole? That's a little different vision of what health is. And then you might have to retreat back to that word that Aubrey doesn't like, natural. You might say that within a given species, there is something like a natural lifespan for which the other purposes of the life, not just persistence in living, are best served. And that suddenly puts the issue out of the medical arena. This is not just a medical question. And medicalizing it, turning it into the question of health, is, in my mind, an error. I think what's more important is to look at what makes a human life dignified, noble, purposeful, and, to my mind, a contribution to the general trend of human existence. And those are very important issues. And yeah, okay.
So I think, do you have a question over here? Yeah.
We can't see you. You
can't
gotta know
see
that,
you.
right?
Can you see me now?
Yeah, I can see you now.
Is this?
Oh, thank you.
Okay. First of all, as far as nature goes and humans' relationship to nature, wearing shoes is not natural. It's called an improvement. It seems to me that from the time of cave days, humans have been trying to control nature, controlling fire, using animal skins, animal husbandry, farming, et cetera, and
I think I know where you're going.
Well, let me get there.
We've only got 15 minutes for all of these people, so we need fast questions.
Okay.
Why don't we keep going?
So, all I'm saying is that it seems to me that humans' goal is to eventually control nature, and solving death, living indefinitely in perfect health will be the ultimate goal. And I just want to mention a website, Include Everyone. If you put Include Everyone in Google, it comes up and explains all this stuff.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you very much for this great program.
Thank you. So my fault, bad moderator. I meant to clarify
Bad moderator.
that, I know, I'll be a year off my life. That a question is one sentence and ends with a question mark. So if we could, when you're standing in line, let's edit ourselves, says the editor. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, let me respond to that. I agree with the first premise that human beings do many things that are kind of unnatural. We are strange, as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of an open and indeterminate general purpose organism. Our special species strength is to comprehend and control the world around us. None of that's in doubt. I'm a physician. I intervene against nature, and I do it with positive purposes. But there's something to be said for doing it within the comprehensive frame of understanding the purposes for which we do it. And that means that the means and the ends should comport. They should go together and they should be consistent with each other. I do not believe that the goal of human life is simply and only described by health and longevity.
Sir?
Well, aging is probably not just the accumulation of free radicals or the grinding down of your cartilage. It's also the clipping of your telomeres, which is called the Hayflick.
What's the question?
Every chromosome in your body has got 50 telomeres, so they can only divide, your cells can only divide 50 times. Then you start to die because you lose genetic information. So the question is, to both of you, for Aubrey, how do you expect to extend the telomeres of every cell in your body, even an existing living person? And to you, why do you think that's impossible?
Yeah, Len Hayflick has a lot to answer for. He's a great friend of mine, but the fact is he should not have called this replicative senescence because it got into people's heads the idea that telomere shortening is a fundamental limit on how long we can live that will forever be immutable, which I don't think he ever really believed. The fact is that the telomere shortening in the Hayflick limit was discovered using cells of a particular type, fibroblasts, from the lower layer of the skin, the dermis, which do not, in the real world, in actual people, divide very often at all. They essentially only divide when they are stimulated to do so by being in a wound, for example. And that's part of why they are so easy to grow in cell culture, which is why it was possible to grow them 100 years ago. But it also means that the experiments that demonstrated the existence of the Hayflick limit were grossly non-physiological. Now, in the body, there are some cells which do divide reasonably regularly, but they don't have a Hayflick limit that matters either because they express this enzyme telomerase, which counteracts the shortening of telomeres that occurs during cell division. So therefore, they can divide much more than 50 times. There are only a small number of aspects of aging that may be influenced to some extent by replicative senescence, by shortening of telomeres and consequent lack of cell division. The immune system is actually part of this. So I'm not saying it doesn't have any role, but it certainly doesn't have as much of a role as some people tend to believe. However, the question is, if it has any role at all, what do we do about it? And of course, that's a reasonable question. And indeed, it may be that in our efforts to counteract cancer, which kills us basically because it overcomes the Hayflick limit due to by mutation, we actually need to make the Hayflick limit more of a problem and then fix that as a secondary adjunct therapy. And I'm totally open to that because there are plenty of ways of doing that. In particular, when cells divide and they cease to be able to divide or they die because of the Hayflick limit, one can, of course, in principle, replace those cells using stem cells. And we are indeed looking at doing exactly that in a number of tissues where this may be a problem. So again, you just need to understand how the particular phenomenon that occurs naturally actually fits into the whole mechanism, the whole network of mechanisms, and you just need to tinker in the same way that any mechanic would do for a simple man-made machine.
So the masterclass on telomeres in 5 seconds, I think that is our next Chronicle Chat, perhaps. Mehdi, do you want to have a question?
Let me just say this. There are many technical questions, and they're all very interesting, but if we they're kind of in the weeds. Let's talk about the large question we came here to talk about, and that is, should we live forever?
Do you have an out-of-the-weeds question in the back?
I think so.
All right.
So on the last question, or last part, Bill was talking about relevance. How do we find relevance? Or should we? Should we care about it? I think most people in here do. I don't. So my question for Aubrey, because I know Bill's answer, is you made it at least implied to me that there's if you extend your life period, we have more time to do things, so we should spend our time doing things. We have time to work. And is that a moral imperative for you?
No. I told you that you should have time to work because you're a lazy bastard who's doing nothing in Tucson, Arizona. But the fact is...
See, well, that's the answer.
But no, the fact is, the reason I spend my life the way I do is not something that I can justify, that I can explain. I have always, since I was a young kid, wanted to spend my life making a difference to people's quality of life.
But that's not the question.
Wait a minute, let me finish.
I'm asking for
let me finish.
else.
I will answer your question with
All right.
Okay, so I've always wanted to do that. Before I was a biologist, I was a computer scientist for the same reason. I was working in artificial intelligence research because I thought that it was a terribly bad thing that people had to spend so much of their time doing stuff that they wouldn't do unless they were being paid for it, so we needed more automation, right? And I only switched to being a biologist when I made this tragic, completely unexpected discovery that most biologists thought that aging was rather uninteresting and unimportant, and hardly anybody was working on it. But if you ask me the next question, which is a perfectly reasonable question, why do I want to make a difference? You know, what is my justification for my perception of my meaning of my life? I have no answer. And here's the critical point. I don't care that I have no answer. It's just me. I am that way. I don't have any argument why other people should be that way. I'm very pleased that quite a lot of people are because they're helping me with this mission. But the fact is, I do not think there is any, turtles all the way down kind of thing. I don't think that I can justify any definition of the meaning of life or what it ought to be.
Yeah, well, you may not be able to articulate it, but you operate with one.
Yes.
And everybody does. That's the thing. I mean, we're very blind to the fact that any discussions like this are grounded in normative judgments, general philosophical or theological perspectives. And that's where, and I think that's right. You can't derive what we should do this purely from the science.
Reductionist.
The point is that one has to finally go back and to ask oneself what makes a meaningful life. And there may be a diversity of perspectives on this, and that might be good. But I think for most people, and I for one, believe that the normal healthy lifespan that we live without dramatic interventions, inventions which could become burdensome, and preoccupations that are somehow ungraceful and unbecoming of life, in my perspective. But at that point, I think one gives over. I mean, think about the normal lifespan now is heading toward 80, 90, 100 years, maybe 120 years maximum. Think of what that lifespan's like. It's a normal, sort of comprehensible lifespan. It's intelligible to us. We have children, we're born, we're given nurture, we have children of our own, and we can live on and perhaps hopefully live to see our own grandchildren, experiencing the three basic categories of life: children, parents, and grandparents. It's a life where there's a kind of natural pacing, a natural rhythm and rhyme of self-donation, of dependency, responsibility, and then a certain ceding over to a more generative giving, less striving, less struggling. There's a beauty in that. And I think there's something to be said for a life seen in that light, not necessarily a life that's pumped continuously forward with technological interventions. I've talked to quite a few people in the last few weeks about what they would like, including a lot of people working in the medical center, and I haven't found a single person who expresses a desire to just get into the longevity escape velocity.
Did you find any who wanted to have Alzheimer's disease at any age?
What did that say?
Did you meet anybody in the medical center or anywhere else who was looking forward to a point where they would get Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, well,
Everybody.
that's a clever quip, but it's not necessarily
It's not clever.
true to
It's
life.
real. Do people want to get sick?
Yeah.
Ever?
It's sort of an abrasive problem. You know eventually that everybody is going to reach a point where there is.
No, they're not.
Well, then
They
they're going to
are
die
not.
on a cliff. Is that the idea?
No, they're not going to get to that cliff.
Is everybody going to go on a cliff?
No, there is
you know,
going
remember-
to be no cliff.
So remember Brave New World? They all lived until 60, and then in 60 days they dropped
Yeah,
straight
that was
off.
fiction. That's not going to be how it
Well,
is.
how do you know?
Because I'm a biologist. I'm doing the research.
I'm a
at the
biologist too.
coalface.
I spent 50 years.
You're
in
a
biology.
medic. I work with future medicine.
All right. We have time for one last question. I apologize for everybody, but do we have one in the back? I missed you guys the first time around.
So do your predictions and beliefs about how technology can stop aging in the future take into account Ray Kurzweil's singularity and the increasing rate that technology is improving?
No, they don't. This is actually a really important feature to take into account, because when people misunderstand this, they make what sounds like a very cogent objection to the whole idea of longevity escape velocity. They say, well, look, we've got this accelerating change, this Moore's law thing that happens in computers, and it's, there are reasons why it might not continue, but there are reasons why we might transcend that. Let's believe that Moore's law works for computers. But for studying and improving on and manipulating really complex systems that we don't understand, like biology, surely that doesn't work. And that's completely valid. I do not believe that our ability to do medicine will actually exhibit accelerating change in terms of our understanding and the sophistication of that medicine. Therefore, the only reason that I think that this concept of longevity escape velocity works is because it doesn't need that. Here's why it doesn't need it. If you are looking closely at what longevity escape velocity means, what it means is reducing, over time, the size of the gaps in our anti-aging arsenal. They're already small because we've evolved so much anti-aging machinery already. Now, when you reduce the gaps, what you're doing is you're slowing down the rate at which damage accumulates, because only a smaller category of types of damage can accumulate, because the others are being repaired as fast as they are being generated. So actually, the rate at which we need to continue to improve the comprehensiveness of these therapies in order to maintain longevity escape velocity does not accelerate. It doesn't even stay the same. It actually decelerates. The minimum rate at which we need to continue to improve goes down.
That's very unproven. But let me say this.
It's maths. It's proven. It's
regardless of how
mathematics.
it's done. We're in danger with biotechnology. We're being tossed out into possibilities that are not familiar to our culture. We're going to have to think very deeply about this. We're going to have to be very careful about these matters. If we unbalance and erode the sense of significance in our lives, we will end up with something we already have too much of, that is deaths of despair. Look out at life. Life is very complicated. Did you know 1 in 6 members of our species dies from drug overdoses? 1 in 6 worldwide. We have 350 million people in this world suffering in any given year from serious depression. We have a growing problem of suicide in our society. And recently, a study came out showing the increased sense of loneliness that's pervading our society. Technology has its benefits, for sure, but we've lost the philosophical and religious perspectives in which we framed our lives historically. We're knocked off balance by our biotechnology, and we have to be very, very careful the way we go forward. And we can't just trust that each technological problem will solve another one because it'll bring more with it. There's something called the Daedalus effect. Remember, Daedalus made the wings of wax, but then Icarus flew too close to the sun and it melted. The Daedalus effect means that we solve one problem with a technological problem, with a technological answer, but we deliver more. And that means we have to be extremely careful, very sober, and we have to place ourselves within the frame